Hello everyone, this is Doug Young. In this video I want to talk to you about isotopes, sort of introducing them and then trying to clear up some misconceptions that folks have about what an isotope means in chemistry. So if we take a look at the periodic table, in this slide I kind of blew up the upper right hand portion. The observation that students make that seem to drive their questions about isotopes is things like, if you take a look at the mass of boron, right? So you have your average atomic mass. If you take a look at your average mass, a boron looks to be 10.81 grams per mole. And when you're starting to learn what a atom is comprised of, right, protons, neutrons, electrons, people want to look at boron and say, well, if I know I have boron, I know that a number of protons is 5 because that's its atomic number. I know that the number of electrons that a boron atom has is the same number as the number of protons that there are, since this is a neutral atom. I'm not talking about a boron ion or anything. And then they get sort of stumped when they ask about the neutrons, right? Because you sort of probably learned that the number of protons plus neutrons equals the mass of the atom. Electrons do have mass, they just weigh so little that they contribute very little to the total mass. So if you have, for example, 4 protons and 4 neutrons, the mass of your atom is going to be about 8. But if you look at this, right, this number here, the problem is that this number here is not 10 and it's not 11, right? So what do you do for this? Is this 10 or is this 11, for your mass? Because you have 5 protons and you have 5 protons here. So the question is, how many neutrons should you draw or predict for boron? And the answer is that there is no just one answer, because boron has many different isotopes. There are many different atoms of boron that have different masses. And like you can see here, in this case right here, the number of neutrons that boron atom should have is 5. The number of neutrons that this one should have would be 6. So what's the answer? Does boron have 5 neutrons or 6 neutrons? And students usually want like one hardcore answer. And the answer is it comes in a mixture of weights. Some weigh 5, some weigh 6, some weigh more, some weigh less. Some have 5 neutrons, some have 6 neutrons. Some have more or less than either 5 or 6. So it can really vary wildly. Let me give you sort of a different analogy to hopefully clarify this up a little bit more here. So I'm going to compare animals versus atoms, right? I'm just going to pick 2 animals. I've got dogs, right? So the weighted average mass of a dog, about 25 kilograms. That's like 40 pounds. And you might be hearing that number and think, whoa, 40 pounds for a dog. There's so many dogs that are smaller than that. Or you might be thinking, whoa, that's so small. My dog weighs way more than 45 pounds. And so even though all dogs are dogs, right, there are large ones. There are some that are larger and some that are smaller. We know this, right? You know that a Chihuahua, right, is way less than 25 kilograms. And you know that, a Mastiff, a Wolfhound, something larger, probably weighs more than 25 kilograms. Now, it's not that those dogs that weigh more or less are not dogs anymore. It's just that dogs come in many different weights, many different masses. Same thing could be true of atoms, right? So if you look down at a hydrogen atoms weigh about 1.0079 grams. And because you have hydrogen, some hydrogens are larger, they weigh more. I don't want to say larger, I'll say heavier. Some hydrogens are heavier, and some hydrogens are lighter. They're still all hydrogens, just like those are all still dogs up there. It's just that some are lighter and some only weigh 1, right? Some have a mass of 1 gram per mole, essentially, and some have a mass of 2 grams per mole. Some have a mass of 3 grams per mole. And so there are some hydrogens that weigh different amounts, but they're still all hydrogens because they have the same property, and they're defined by the fact that they have the same number of protons. In hydrogen's case, just 1 proton. Hydrogen, right? Most hydrogens weigh only 1. There are very few hydrogens that weigh 2. There are some hydrogens that weigh 3. They even have special names in this case. That's tritium, deuterium, and hydrogen, going from 3 to 1. But you'll notice that this average mass is not an exact number because it's going to be a mixture of hydrogen 1, hydrogen 2, and hydrogen 3s. Just like when you look at an average mass of a dog, not all dogs weigh 25, right? Some weigh less than 25, some weigh more than 25 kilograms. And you could extend this out, right? You could look at beetles, right? Same thing. So if you have a beetle, some are heavier, some are lighter. And they just come in different sizes, right? Heavier ones can be like 100 grams. Light ones can be on the order of milligrams. So they can just have really, really different masses. It doesn't mean they're not beetles, right? Beetles are defined not by how much they weigh. Beetles are defined by, the fact that they have 6 legs, they don't have skeletons, they have exoskeletons, they have such and such body parts, right? They're defined by other features, their properties, not by their masses. And again, the same thing is true when you're talking about atoms, right? A chlorine atom is not defined by its weight. It's defined by how many protons it has and its behavior. So chlorine is the same way. For chlorine specifically, can look at some chlorine atoms. Some chlorine atoms weigh 35. In fact, about 75% of them weigh 35. And there are other chlorine atoms that weigh 37. And there's about 25% of those, or 25% of all the chlorine atoms out there weigh about 37. And again, if you take this average, right, this average of these different masses, you get what we report on the periodic table, which is the average mass of all of the different isotopes for that element. So if you ask how much chlorine weighs, what you mean is you're saying what's the average chlorine atom weigh? And by average we mean there's a mixture of isotopes. Those isotopes all weigh different amounts. Let me give you an example with carbon here. So carbon, right? Carbon has an average mass of 12.011 grams per mole. But again, it's not like there's only one type of carbon. There are many different isotopes of carbon. The carbon that there is most abundant is carbon-12, as you might guess from the mass. The mass looks really close to 12. The most common one is carbon-12. Carbon-12. Normally when you write the symbol, right, when you write the symbol for carbon, it's just a big C, right? According to the periodic table, the atomic symbol for carbon is a C. When you write just a C like this, what you're saying is you're talking about the average carbons on Earth, our naturally occurring abundance on Earth. If you don't mean just the big mixture of all the different isotopes, what you need to do is you put as a superscript in front what the isotope number is, or what the mass number is. Right, this is your mass. This number right here is the mass. So if I continue with this table here, number of protons for carbon-12. Remember that, again, an element is defined by the number of protons it has. So if it's carbon, no matter what isotope of carbon it is, it's got to have 6 protons, right? Anything with 6 protons is called carbon. But this is where we need to do a little bit of simple math here. Then how many neutrons does it have, right? Because remember that the number of protons and neutrons is basically the mass. So if you look at the number of protons plus neutrons, that should equal the mass. So if I look back at this number here, right, I know that the mass is 12 for my carbon-12, so therefore the number of protons I must have is 6, right? Because 6 plus 6 is 12. And again, number of electrons should be the same as the number of protons because I don't have an ion here. Now the percent abundance, this is something you just look up. You can't look at a periodic table. You'd find this in a book. You'd look it up online. There's big tables of all of these. But if you look this up, what you're going to see is that basically 98.9% of all of the carbon atoms on this planet are carbon-12s, right? So almost 99% of all the carbon atoms on this planet are 12. That may be different on another planet. It may be different on a meteor that lands or something like that. But overall, on average, about 99% of them on Earth weigh 12. What's kind of interesting as a side note is that the periodic table gets updated every now and again. And the average masses on the periodic table will change as we get more data in, as scientists around the world collaborate and realize that there are different abundances of different isotopes. They'll actually change the average mass that you see on a periodic table, so that happens sometimes. But now, so carbon-12, right, while it's 99% of all the carbon out there, it's not the only type. There is also carbon-13 out there. So again, I just write that number 13, the mass, right above and in front, so it's a superscript in front. As far as number of protons go, again, it's 6 because it's carbon. But now I have to look back at the neutrons, right? Because I need this to add up. Whatever number goes here, I need it to add up to 13. So this is how isotopes differ, right? They differ only in the number of neutrons they have. So now my carbon-13 is basically only different because it has one more neutron than carbon-12 does. Electrons don't change because, again, this is neutral, so the number of electrons should be the same as the number of protons, right? Electrons are negative, protons are positive, same amount if it's not an ion. And then if you look at the percent abundance of carbon-13, it's about 1.1, a little less, about 1.1% of all the carbon out there is carbon-13. So just 1 in 100 more or less. Then if I look lastly, I've got one more space here. There is another naturally occurring isotope, that's carbon-14. And you can probably get the gist by now, right? Still has 6 protons, but this must now have 8 neutrons to add up to 14. Still 6, and this is like 0.0001, or no, 0.1%. 0.1% of all the carbon out there is carbon-14. So just a trace amount, just a dusting of it. And so those are the 3 main isotopes of carbon, right? They're all carbon. They all mostly behave like normal carbon does. There's very, very little that differs between them aside from the mass. But it's these 3 different types of carbons, right? They're like different species of dog. They're all carbons still, but they just weigh different amounts. They just weigh different amounts. And so if you look at the weighted average, right? So if you take all of these abundances and their masses, if you look at this weighted average, that's what this number is supposed to be, right? So if 99% of them weigh 12, that's why this number is so close to 12. And there's heavier isotopes present, so this number is just slightly above 12. So again, the average masses that you see on the periodic table reflect the natural abundance of these different isotopes. Let's do a couple more examples. If someone just writes O, this is just a symbol O. They're talking about the natural abundance of oxygen atoms. And you'd just look this up on the periodic table and you'd say, okay, well, if I'm talking about the average, oxygen, I know that weighs, according to the periodic table, 15.99 basically grams per mole. But if someone writes 18 in front of that 0, now they're talking about one specific isotope. If I can write today. One specific isotope of oxygen, namely the one that weighs just 12. The one that weighs, sorry, not 12, 18 grams per mole. So if you see this number, again, like I wrote up there, if you see a superscript in front of an atomic symbol, that is the mass that you're talking about. That's the mass. So the only thing that changes here is the number of neutrons. So if you see a superscript, they're talking about a specific isotope, and what you're changing here is the number of neutrons. That's the only difference between different isotopes of the same element. So if you're talking about fluorine 10 versus fluorine 11, the only difference is 1 neutron. If you're talking about bromine 79 and bromine 81, you're talking about a difference of 2 neutrons between those 2 different isotopes. So I hope that helps you a little bit figuring out what an isotope is and then how we deal with these symbols. It just refers to the same element. It has a different mass because of the number of neutrons it has. So for my students, you should definitely go online and do that practice worksheet with the atomic structure. And so there's other reasons why we care about the fact that there are different isotopes. For example, if I just kind of clean up this slide a little bit here. If you look at our carbon-12, 13, 14 isotopes, not all isotopes are as stable as one another. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 are very stable. And they have half-lives, which is just how long they stick around. They have half-lives that are extremely, extremely long. They're very, 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 very stable. However, if you look at carbon-14, carbon-14 is not as stable. So this specific isotope is radioactive. And not radioactive in a harmful way to us, like we think about, some power plant or something exploding. It's just radioactive, that just means that it decays. And some of you may have heard of carbon-14 before in carbon dating. So when they talk about carbon dating or carbon-14 dating, what they're looking at is how long does it take for this to decay. So used in carbon dating. Because about half of the carbon-14 that's around decays in about 5,200 years or so. So half of the amount decreases by half. So it's used in carbon-13 dating. So that carbon-14 behaves differently than carbon-12 does and carbon-13 does. Again, in most aspects, they behave the same. However, some ways they're a little bit different. They have a little bit different reactivity. Similarly, if you look at iodine, right, if you compare iodine in general, right, is a required nutrient. Like we need this, right? We need iodine in our diets. We need iodine in our diets. It's super important for thyroid function. There's one of our hormones has a whole bunch of iodines on it. So if you don't get enough iodine, you can get things like goiters and you get metabolic issues, hypothyroidism, or maybe it's hyper. I don't remember which one. But thyroid problems, metabolism problems. Now, what needs to be said, though, is that iodine-131 is radioactive. And not in a good way. It's a problem. And so when those nuclear power plants in Japan had problems back when there was that tsunami, one of the concerns was that iodine-131 would be released. And the problem with iodine-131 is not only is it radioactive, but like I was just saying, our body needs it, so our body keeps it. And our body will hold on to the iodine because we can't really tell the difference between iodine-131 and like 127 or 6 or something like that. And so our body holds on to it, and it can lead to thyroid cancer. Because, like I was saying before, the iodine's all concentrated into your thyroid. And so what people do if they're exposed to iodine-131 and they don't want to get cancer, what you do is you actually just take a whole bunch of non-radioactive iodine that doesn't weigh 131, and you just eat a bunch of that. You take iodine tablets, usually potassium iodide or something like that, sodium iodide, and you kind of dilute out the 131. Because if your body has lots of iodine, it'll kind of let it go and release it. It's just when your body has very little iodine, it really holds onto it tightly because we need to make sure that you have iodine so you function right. So the differences between the different isotopes are the masses, which basically come from the number of neutrons that they have, and they do have some properties where some isotopes are more radioactive than other ones. And I'm not going to talk about radioactivity here. That's another video for another day. But different isotopes can have different properties like radioactivity. So that concludes my introduction to you guys for isotopes. I hope you found that helpful and that you have a better idea of the difference between isotopes now. Thank you very much.